Greetings, travelers. I know you're shocked that hardly known anime reviewer and plot summarizer Misshapen Chair is making a very rare, highly intricate, and detailed video guide for Final Fantasy XIV on the PC. It's crazy to think that not a single person on the planet knows how to play Sage until this video finally came out. It's because nobody has beaten Shadowbringers yet. Nobody can get past Titania. Thankfully, as a verified Titania Ultimate Slayer and Endwalker plot enjoyer, I am here to once again bring salvation to the community. If salvation meant suffering. Sage is not my favorite Spice Girl, but it is also a social experiment from the Final Fantasy XIV developers to see how functionally equivalent they can make two jobs and how fervently the weakest Final Fantasy XIV fan will convince themselves that they are distinct. See Dark Knight and Paladin reworks for similar effects. This is because Sage and Scholar have about 83% skill overlap. It says so on this very official looking piece of paper. After saying that, I'm sure you're ready to argue about how these Plonk length differences technically matter for one of the Savage floors, or Ultimate phases that you personally ran and farmed thousands of times over by now. And I would love to discuss the semantics about how Panheima and Expedient are different cooldowns, but at the end of the day, all I am going to say is that Nocturnal and Diurnal Astro felt more distinct from each other, meaning the game felt like we had more diverse healing options back when there were only 3 healers, in my opinion, which, as we are all aware, is the only valid one. And I didn't even like Nocturnal Astro. If that sounds a little too negative, just remember, I don't even like video games. So before we begin, make sure to slap your fairy targeting system on your preferred tank at the beginning of combat. Sage's fairy is a bit weird as it will only heal every time you use a GCD that says it procs it, instead of casting a heal of its own free will on the lowest percent HP target. This means that if you're one of these players who insists on not rolling their GCD while playing healer, Sage will make your gameplay even more egregious. I know that you are all agents sent by Yoshi P himself to try to get me upset, but just remember, there's one player who I hate above all else. It's all part of the carrot and stick approach of trying to get Warriors of Light to actually play the game, even though Fairy and Kardia are as functionally equivalent down to the healing potency itself, unless you buff it by 70% for the next 4 procs. However, I will concede that you can manually direct your fairy, unlike Scholar, who used to be able to do that in previous expansions, but don't remind them about that because they get off on the idea of being fucked over again. Now, with the thesis of this guide being that both jobs are highly similar, your next instinct is probably going to be to ask me which job is better. Well, that's easy. Go to FF logs, see which job has marginally higher RDPS, and that's the better job. Then complain about how unbalanced the game is and that the other job needs to be buffed. Maybe mix in a little harassment while you're there. Now you're a typical Final Fantasy XIV raider. All you have to do to become a typical Final Fantasy XIV healer is passively aggressively blame your co-healer for everything when stuff goes wrong, and take all the credit when it goes right. Bonus points if you think you're above criticism because you can stop healing at any time and ruin a fight. Because I too can just not do my job and kill us all. In fact, I'm pretty good at that one. Sage, like all healers, has a filler single target DPS button and a 30-second dot. The only difference is that Sage's dot requires a 2-button combo to activate. Euthanasia acts more like a weave that you use right before a cooldown that eats both weaving slots, which makes it kinda similar to Kite. Sage is the best healer in Final Fantasy XIV. This is why Endwalker is the greatest expansion in terms of healer gameplay. European Union also is an attempt to condense the 4 standard GCD heals and 2 GCD DPS buttons into 4 buttons instead. A massive savings on hotbar space spoken from a chair with 4 hotbars and an extensive Nekopara merchandise collection. If you ever fuck up and press it when you didn't want to, you can always cleanse the buff with a simple right click. The amount of times you would want to use a non-augmented euphonium GCD heal are equal to how many videos I've made about Nier Automata. So we could just have euphoric GCD heals and 2 DPS buttons and we'd have the exact same amount of hotbar space without this gimmick. The only meaningful difference is that your primary GCD heals are technically instant cast, but it is better to say that you don't have to stand still. This is because it still takes a second to press button 1 before you press button 2. Compare this to Scholar's Adlo, where the shield comes out early into the cast bar, and realistically, there's about a 0.66, repeating of course, second difference between them. And if that split second mattered in your healing plan, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but you're a poor planner. Welcome to the club. Just like Scholar, your single target shield can crit heal and apply a massive, girthy shield, but it can't spread it around like it's the newest COVID variant. That's Scholar exclusive, and we are all aware that GCD shields between different shield healers do not stack. Since you can move around while casting it, you can do things like throw a shield on your tank while they're pulling the entire dungeon like a certified mediocre tank player, or for just movement tech in general if you have to heal at the same time. The only downside of this process is that all erudite skills are unaffected by spell speed, meaning that your GCD drifts ever so slightly every single time you use one, which could all be solved with a very simple line of code. But if there is one thing that the creators hate more than the community telling them how to make the game, it's when that suggestion comes from a filthy English-speaking American. It's okay, I make up for this by not being able to afford healthcare in my country. Speaking of shields, when breaking a Sage GCD shield trademark, either on your single target shield or on yourself if you shielded everybody, you will get a stack of Adderall. Oh wait, sorry, I misread that. Dark Arts, which can be spent on Toxicon, an instant cast GCD that does the same damage as your normal filler spell on single target after level 82. Don't ask me about numbers before level 90, it's not real and can't hurt me outside of 60% of the currently available ultimate fights. This isn't DPS neutral, since you have to use a GCD heal and then press Toxicosis, meaning that its potency would need to be doubled if they wanted it to be true DPS neutrality. And I have no strong feelings on the matter. I just wonder where all the white mage players are after complaining about Afflatus for 3 years straight. Seems like your opinions aren't consistent after all. This is just a movement tech that you get as consequence of GCD healing when it's necessary, not something that you should be actively fishing for. So just like hardcore stimulants, people think they're being really productive when using it, when in reality you spend more time trying to get more hits of the good stuff than actually doing anything useful. Exception for ADHD and associated conditions implied. Although if you want to make that potency change and you want to get me on board with your movement, you already know what button I want back in the game. Mana shift. Who gives a fuck about single target though? When does it become a gain? On 2, baby? Although it is a loss on 34 over your normal AoE filler. A travesty really because of how frequent that scenario is. Hey, when does that happen?
Well, actually, it happens in various...
If things are currently going to shit, you can convert your currently existing shields into a heal by using Pepsis. It is always an AoE heal regardless of if you convert the single target or AoE shield into a heal. This is kind of functionally similar to emergency tactics, although different enough to have some better use cases. Since it heals for a flat amount, if you take a raid wide and it doesn't quite break the shield, you can get some nice bonus healing out of it. But since its healing doesn't scale with the size of the shield, it doesn't matter if you crit heal or try to buff your next GCD heal with something like Zoe and then press Pepsis, as it will still heal for the same flat amount. So in some situations it's better than Scholar, and in others, Scholar is better. Isn't that a wild idea? In order to make Sage technically different from a DPS rotation standpoint, you have a melee ranged nuke that holds 2 charges with a 40-second recharge timer. That sounds real hardcore, but we all love the 2-minute metagame, which means that you use 2 charges after 3 GCDs into combat, and then 1 random charge at some point before you slam 2 in again at the 2-minute raid buff window. And then the even minute cycle continues. Now they could make it so that you couldn't stand in range during a raid buff window and have to think for a second about your rotation, but I know for a fact that the encounter designers don't have balls that big and the raiding community's skin that thick. You see, I believe that both parties are guilty of contributing to the current raid design. Nobody is innocent except for me, of course, as I am above criticism. You now have a flawless understanding of how the DPS is a normal healer in Final Fantasy XIV. Strangely though, Sage does have other healing cooldowns, especially ones that can be casted without interrupting your endless stream of Kardia procs. I will now have to explain not Aetherflow. Every 20 seconds you will generate a stack of not Aetherflow. This can be spent on a variety of cooldowns that will all give you back 7% of your MP. This is once again different from pressing Aetherflow to get 3 stacks every minute and 20% of your MP back, because Sage gets 1% more MP per minute over Scholar. So where's the buff? It makes up for this by not having a way to dump extra stacks, meaning that for your MP economy, you have to press an OGCD heal randomly to keep the MP flowing, even if there is nothing to heal. it is only the most mentally painful thing for me to do in the entire game. But if it had energy drain, it would be a little too obvious how similar these jobs are. As far as options to spend this completely unique resource, you have not Lustrate, a wimpy single target heal, not Indomitability, a wimpy AoE heal, and not Sacred Soil, because I refuse to let you take that away from me. Is Sacred Soil technically better in certain situations since you can disjoint it from yourself compared to just giving people the exact same buff who are nearby? Yeah, probably, although a 10% mitt with regen attached to it is still unironically very strong. Especially when people can walk around with that buff and not be limited to where you place the However, there is one unique skill, Taro Chole, which is a big single target heal that also mitigates damage for that individual by 10%. So you have to heal a bunch in order to apply the 10% mitigation. But using a big heal is something you want to do after you've already taken a bunch of damage. And mitigation is what you want to use right before you take a ball buster. Look, it's great in dungeon trash pulls, but more annoying to use in raid settings. Because if you want to maximize the mitt, you have to waste part of the heal, and if you want to maximize the heal, you have to waste part of the mitt. There are situations where you can get value out of both, which is fantastic, but it's not as common. Just remember that its mitigation doesn't stack with not Sacred Soil, so you should probably spread those cooldowns out over the course of a trash pull for a solid 10% mitigation assistance for 45 seconds straight. You could even give yourself a single stack of not Aetherflow on a 90-second cooldown, which I can't tell if this is worse recitation or worse dissipation. So I'll leave it up to you, dear traveler. That was a very exciting exercise, but we aren't quite done yet with the rest of OGCD cooldowns. Kratos applies a buff to a single party member that increases all healing by 20%. Yes, this can stack with Zophiel and can be used to try and get a big shield or just help in tight healing situations. Not super practical all the time, but it's free and has a pretty short cooldown. Hollow X will heal and shield, and I probably could make a Miztech joke along with that, but I don't really like name-dropping Final Fantasy XIV creators often because I don't know how much they tolerate a 100% orange juice guide maker such as myself. It's also a 10% party-wide mitigation on top of applying a pretty beefy shield, making this one of the best raid-wide mitigation cooldowns in the entire game, which you can also use in trash pulls because that mitigation does stack with your other ones and you will get it back before the next boss. Physicist is a free AoE regen that also increases healing potency by 10%, which is a condensed version of Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination without the magic mitigation. If only Sage had another mitigation cooldown to make up for it. Hi Mom is a shield that applies a new weaker shield every time it's broken, up to 5 times. It's free and trash for your tank and useful against things like boss autos and raids. Pan Hi Mom is that, but AoE, which you might as well use in trash because it's free and very useful for repeated raid wives such as J-Waves. Finally, you have Pneumonia, which is your level 90 big-ass heal skill that, despite being a GCD, doesn't interrupt your DPS or Kardia procs. Neat. But as a consequence, you can only use it if an enemy is currently targetable. The only other utility that Sage has over the rest of the healers is a gap closer that can jump to enemies or allies, also known as Thunderclap. You could even use a mouse over macro for that if you hate buffering abilities and like mashing like me. This feels kinda lame though, so if you want to know the swag strat of using gap closers to negate knockback effects, you want to time your press right as the knockback animation starts, not the cast time. And if you time it correctly, you will overwrite the initial movement effect. This will cause teammates to be amazed when you succeed, and wonder what the fuck you're doing if you screw it up. Surecast does exist for a reason, just like every other shared healing cooldown. But you can use this exploit to negate knockback effects that can't be made immune with Surecast. If you want my actual opinions without all the sarcasm, Sage and Scholar are two jobs that have slight advantages in certain situations over each other. In terms of design from a functional standpoint of both jobs are viable but edge out usefulness a little bit depending on the encounter, I would say they did a good job. The thing is, they accomplished this by playing it so incredibly safe with design choices, and what you are left with is something that doesn't feel very unique and was stale before it even released. If you want to make something exciting and interesting, you're going to have to take some creative risks. Something that Sage is completely devoid of. That's why I deserve a job like this. Now let's get out there and wait at least another 3 months before my next Final Fantasy XIV video.